When the sheriff found her crying by the river, a grieving lady finds hope when a sheriff risks everything to save her. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the Wyoming Valley, gilding the hills and painting the river in molten gold. The air smelled faintly of pine and wild sage. It should have been a beautiful day, but for Evelyn Harper, beauty had lost its meaning. She sat by the riverbank, her dark skirt soaked at the hem where it brushed the shallows. The gentle sound of the water lapping against smooth stones was the only answer to her soft, broken sobs. In her trembling hands she held a silver locket, dulled by fingerprints and time. Inside was the image of her late husband, Thomas Harper, a strong rancher with a kind smile and calloused hands that had once made her feel safe. He had died 6 months ago when his horse slipped down a ravine during a storm that had taken her life's joy along with him. Now the world felt empty. Evelyn's eyes, swollen from crying, turned to the letter on her lap. The paper was creased and damp where her tears had fallen. It was from the First Bank of Clearwater, cold and final. If the remaining balance of $170 is not paid within 30 days, the property known as the Harper homestead will be repossessed. Her heart clenched. The ranch Thomas had built, the same one where they dreamed of raising children, was slipping through her fingers. A gust of wind stirred the grass, scattering the dry leaves along the riverbank. She thought of how quiet the house had become, no laughter, no boots on the porch, no voice calling her name. Just silence. Endless silence. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thomas, I don't know how much longer I can keep going." The current rippled beside her boots, and for a brief, dangerous moment she thought about stepping forward, just far enough to make the ache stop. But a distant sound broke through her thoughts, hoofbeats. Steady. Rhythmic. Growing closer. Evelyn quickly wiped her cheeks and straightened her posture, though her shoulders sagged under the weight of grief. She turned her head just as a chestnut horse appeared through the brush, its rider outlined by the setting sun. It was Sheriff Caleb Turner. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, his presence both commanding and calm. The glint of his badge caught the light, but his eyes, gray and steady, held no judgment. Only quiet concern. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, respectful, carrying easily across the quiet water. "Everything all right here?" Evelyn forced a weak smile. "I'm fine, Sheriff. Just thinking." Caleb dismounted with practiced ease, boots crunching on gravel. "You're a mile past where most folks come to think," he said gently, walking closer but keeping a polite distance. "Not the safest spot to sit alone this time of day." She looked away. "I didn't realize I needed permission to cry by the river." He tipped his hat slightly, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "You don't. But sometimes a soul sittin' by the water looks like it's searchin' for something, or maybe saying goodbye." Her breath hitched. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. The sheriff crouched down near the edge of the river, watching the sunlight shimmer over the surface. "I used to come down here after my pa died," he said quietly. "Figured the river knew what to do with a man's pain better than he did himself." Evelyn blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected that kind of honesty, not from a man like him. She glanced at his badge, then at his weathered hands resting on his knees. He wasn't here as a lawman right now. He was just another soul who'd known loss. "I lost my husband," she murmured. 6 months ago. The bank's taking what little we had left. I don't even know where I'll go next." Caleb's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly, his eyes softening. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Harper. I truly am." They both fell silent, the sound of the river filling the space between them, calm and steady, as if it could carry their burdens away if only they'd let it. Finally, Caleb rose to his feet and extended a hand to help her up. She hesitated, then took it. His palm was warm, firm, grounding. "Come on," he said. "Sun's getting low. Let me ride with you back home." Evelyn wanted to refuse, to tell him she was fine, but something in his tone made it impossible. It wasn't pity. It was care. As they walked together along the trail, her hand occasionally brushing against his sleeve, she realized that for the first time in months, she didn't feel entirely alone. And as the river faded behind them, the sheriff glanced her way once more, his expression unreadable. He'd seen grief before, but something about Evelyn Harper's sadness stirred something deep inside him, something he couldn't yet name. He made a quiet vow to himself then, one that would soon change both their lives. No one deserves to break alone. The next morning dawned cold and pale, the kind of morning that made even the roosters hesitant to crow. A soft fog clung to the fields, and the Harper farmhouse sat silent beneath its thin layer of frost. Evelyn stirred from a sleepless night. The fire in the hearth had long gone out, and the house felt colder than the Wyoming wind outside. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stared at the empty chair across the table, Thomas's chair. His hat still hung by the door. His boots, scuffed and patched, sat beneath the bed. She couldn't bring herself to move them. The day stretched before her like a burden. There were animals to feed, a fence to mend, and the endless ache of uncertainty pressing against her chest. Outside, the frost crunched beneath the hooves of an approaching horse. At first, she tensed. Visitors were rare, and the only men who rode out this far anymore were collectors or trouble. She stepped to the window and pulled back the thin curtain. Sheriff Caleb Turner was dismounting his chestnut mare, his breath visible in the morning air. He carried a small burlap sack over one shoulder and a look of quiet determination. Evelyn quickly ran a hand through her hair and opened the door. "Sheriff Turner?" she asked, surprised. "Is something wrong?" Caleb took off his hat, his voice calm but firm. "Not unless you count a lady livin' on half a loaf of bread and a pot of cold coffee as wrong." Evelyn blinked, unsure how to respond as he stepped forward and set the sack on her porch. She glanced inside: flour, beans, coffee, salt pork, even a small jar of honey. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice catching slightly. "I know," he replied simply. "But I wanted to." Evelyn hesitated. Her pride fought against her gratitude. "I can't accept charity." Caleb's eyes met hers, unwavering. "It ain't charity. It's decency. A town ain't worth much if it can't look after its own." She bit her lip, torn. No one in town had come to check on her since Thomas died. Folks whispered she'd gone strange, spending hours by the river talking to her husband's grave. The sheriff's kindness felt almost foreign. "I'll pay you back when I can," she said softly. He shook his head. "You can pay me by keeping yourself alive and well. That's all I'll ever ask." The words lodged in her throat. No one had spoken to her like that in months, like she still mattered. Caleb's gaze drifted over the worn porch boards, the sagging shutters, and the empty corral beyond. "You're still trying to keep the place up?" She nodded faintly. It was his dream. "I can't let it fall apart." "Then maybe it's time someone helped you hold it together," he said. For a long moment, Evelyn just stared at him. There was no pity in his tone, only quiet resolve, the kind that came from a man who meant what he said. He stepped off the porch and surveyed the yard. "That fence is half down. You got tools?" Yes, but..." "Good. I'll fix it." "Sheriff, you don't have to." "I know," he said again, cutting her off gently. "But sometimes the right thing ain't about having to." Evelyn watched him for a while as he worked. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing strong forearms dusted with sawdust and sun. Each hammer strike echoed through the quiet morning. For the first time in a long while, the sound of work, honest, purposeful work, filled the air again. By noon, the fence stood firm, the boards lined straight. Caleb wiped his brow with a handkerchief and turned back toward her. "Sheriff," she began, her voice soft. "Why are you doing all this for me? You don't even know me." He leaned against the fence, his gaze steady. "Maybe I don't know your story yet, but I know loss when I see it. My ma died when I was a boy. My pa after her. You learn quick that when someone's fallin', you either walk away or you reach out a hand. I made my choice years ago." The words struck deep. Evelyn looked away, eyes glistening. "You can't save everyone." "No," he said quietly. "But that don't mean you stop tryin'. The wind picked up, tugging strands of her hair loose from her braid. For a moment they just stood there, two lonely souls bound by something neither had asked for but both understood. As he prepared to leave, Caleb paused at the steps. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his tone gentler now, "I know about the foreclosure notice. I can't promise miracles, but I'll talk to the mayor, see if there's any way to hold them off." Her breath caught. "You do that?" He nodded. "As long as I wear this badge, no one's talking your land without going through me first. Not while I draw breath." Evelyn's eyes widened, tears threatening to spill. "I don't know how to thank you." He smiled faintly and tipped his hat. "Just promise me one thing, no more sittin' alone by that river thinkin' the world forgot you. It ain't done with you yet, Mrs. Harper." Then he mounted his horse, the sunlight glinting off his badge, and rode away down the dusty trail. Evelyn stood on her porch long after he'd gone, the sack of supplies still in her hands. The cold air brushed her face, but inside her chest, for the first time in half a year, something warm flickered back to life. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "Maybe the world isn't done with me after all." Clearwater was a small town, the kind where every stranger was noticed and every whisper carried twice as far. By midweek, the townsfolk were already buzzing about the sheriff's unexpected visit to the Harper place. "Sheriff Turner's been ridin' out there near every day," said Martha Lyle, the general store clerk, to anyone who'd listen. "Brings her food, fixes her fence, can't say I blame him. She's a pretty widow even if she's a sad one." By the time the sun set, the story had grown wings. Some said Caleb had taken a shine to Evelyn Harper. Others said she was trying to win sympathy to keep her land from the bank. But one man at the saloon listened with far more interest than gossip allowed. Hank Doyle, owner of the saloon and half the county's debts, leaned back in his chair, swirling whiskey in his glass. He was a large man, his beard thick and his eyes mean as a rattler's. "The Harper land?" he said slowly, turning the name over in his mouth. "That's the piece right by the river, fertile soil, good water line?" The barkeep nodded. "That's the one. Shame she can't hold it. Bank's gonna take it soon enough." A slow grin spread across Hank's face. Unless someone helps the process along. He'd wanted that land for years. The river cut through it clean, perfect for expanding his cattle business and building a loading dock for river trade. But Thomas Harper had refused to sell, and then conveniently died in that fall. Hank called it bad luck. Caleb Turner called it suspicious. Now the widow stood in his way and the sheriff was protecting her. Hank's grin faded. "That's a problem," he muttered. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Evelyn stood at her kitchen table with a small vase of wildflowers Caleb had brought that morning. The house still felt lonely, but it no longer felt lifeless. He'd come by to drop off supplies from town, and to fix the broken hinge on her barn door. It was the third day in a row he'd shown up with some excuse to help. At first she thought he pitied her. Now she wasn't so sure. When he smiled, it wasn't out of duty. When he spoke, it wasn't out of obligation. And when he looked at her, really looked at her, she felt seen for the first time in months. As she arranged the flowers, she caught herself humming a tune Thomas used to whistle when he worked the fields. The sound startled her. She stopped, pressing a hand to her lips. "What am I doing?" she whispered. "He's the sheriff. He's just being kind." But deep down she knew kindness didn't look quite like this. That evening, Caleb sat in his small sheriff's office, a single oil lamp flickering over a desk cluttered with reports and wanted posters. He'd been thinking about Evelyn, her tired eyes, her stubborn strength, the way she refused to surrender even when life had taken everything. Deputy Mason knocked and entered, tipping his hat. "You look troubled, boss." Caleb sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You ever see someone carry in so much pain you just want to help lighten it, but you don't know how?" Mason grinned. "Sheriff, sounds like someone's caught you by the heart." Caleb shot him a look, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "It ain't like that. She's lost near everything. Someone's got to look out for her." "Sure," Mason said with a smirk. "And I suppose you're just fixin' her fences out of civic duty." Caleb's smile faded. "You don't know what it's like to bury someone you love." That silenced the deputy. Mason nodded quietly and left the room. Caleb leaned back in his chair, staring out the window toward the dark fields beyond town. He told himself he was only helping her because it was right. But deep down he knew it was more than that. 2 nights later, a shadow passed through the Harper property. The horses in the corral snorted nervously. The wind carried the smell of smoke before Evelyn even saw the orange glow outside her window. "Fire!" she gasped, grabbing a pail and rushing out barefoot. Flames licked up the side of the barn, roaring to life in the night wind. She screamed for help, but there was no one nearby to hear. She tried to beat the flames with her shawl, coughing on the smoke. The horses bucked in panic, their eyes wild. Then hoofbeats. "Evelyn!" Caleb's voice cut through the chaos as he rode in from the road, throwing himself off the saddle. Together, they worked to free the animals, hauling them from the stalls before the roof caved in. By the time the fire burned down to glowing embers, the barn was gone. Evelyn sank to her knees, exhausted, soot on her face, tears streaking through the ash. Caleb knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" She nodded weakly, eyes on the ruins. Everything Thomas built, gone. Caleb looked around, scanning the ground, and froze. Carved into a scorched beam was a set of words, rough and deliberate, burned into the wood by a heated knife. "Sell or you'll wish you had." His jaw tightened, eyes hardening. This wasn't an accident. Evelyn's lip trembled. Who would do this? Caleb stood, the firelight reflecting in his eyes like steel. "I've got a few ideas." He turned toward the road, his hand resting on his revolver. Under the crackle of dying flames, he made a silent vow, the same kind of vow that men like him didn't make lightly. Whoever did this will regret the day they laid a hand on you, Evelyn Harper. The next morning, the Harper homestead was blanketed in gray ash. Smoke still curled faintly from the remains of the barn, drifting into the pale dawn. Evelyn stood barefoot in her yard, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. The cold air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. All she could see were the ruins, the blackened boards, the twisted metal of old tools, the faint outline of where Thomas's initials had once been carved into a beam. Caleb knelt near the wreckage, his face dark with soot and anger. He ran his fingers along the scorched earth, tracing footprints, boot prints. Not random. Deliberate. He followed them a few paces, his eyes narrowing. 2 men, he muttered, crouching low. One heavy, one lighter. They came in from the west ridge on horseback. Probably waited until dark. Evelyn hugged herself. You're sure? He glanced up, his voice tight. This was set. They used kerosene. Whoever did it wanted you scared, not dead. Her throat tightened. But why? I've done nothing to anyone. Caleb stood and turned toward the distant town. Someone wants your land, Evelyn. And I've got a good idea who. Later that day, Clearwater Saloon. The doors swung open with a sharp creak as Sheriff Caleb Turner stepped inside. The smell of whiskey, tobacco, and cheap perfume filled the air. Laughter died down the moment his boots hit the floorboards. Hank Doyle sat at his usual table, leaning back in his chair with that smug, snake-oil grin. He was surrounded by a few of his hired men, rough types with cold eyes and quicker hands. Well now, Hank said, setting down his glass. If it ain't the law himself. What brings you in, Sheriff? Don't tell me you're here for a drink. Caleb's gaze swept the room, then fixed on him. I'm here about a fire. Hank feigned surprise. A fire, you say? Terrible thing, that. Caleb took a slow step closer. You wouldn't happen to know anything about it, would you? The Harper barn burned clean to the ground last night. Left a message carved in the beams. Hank raised an eyebrow, swirling his drink lazily. You think I got time to go burnin' down some widow's barn? I run a business here, Sheriff. I'm a man of community. Caleb's jaw flexed. You're a man of greed. Always have been. The room went still. Even the piano player froze mid-note. Hank set down his glass and leaned forward, his voice dropping low. Careful, Turner. You're wearin' that badge awful high for someone so new to the job. A sheriff without friends in this town don't last long. Caleb stared him down. Then I guess I'll make do without him. He turned and walked out, leaving the saloon door swinging in his wake. Behind him, Hank's smirk vanished. He slammed his fist on the table. If he keeps meddlin', make sure he regrets it. Back at the Harper homestead. Evelyn sat on the porch steps that evening, her hands clasped in her lap. The sun dipped behind the hills, turning the sky a soft amber. The horses Caleb had saved grazed quietly nearby. She heard the familiar sound of hoofbeats before she saw him. Caleb dismounted and removed his hat, his expression grim. Did you find anything? She asked softly. He nodded. Tracks lead toward town. Likely Doyle's men. But I've got no proof yet, not the kind the mayor'll act on. Then what will you do? He glanced toward the horizon, jaw tight. Keep digging. Sometimes the law don't move fast enough, but I can still make sure he knows I'm watching. Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes glistening. You could get yourself hurt. He smiled faintly, though his eyes were shadowed. Wouldn't be the first time. Comes with the badge. She stood and stepped closer. Why risk so much? For me? He hesitated. For a moment he couldn't find the words. The way she looked at him, soft, searching, fragile, disarmed him more than any outlaw's gun ever could. Finally he said quietly, because when I found you by that river, I saw someone ready to give up. I won't let this town, or that man, take what little you've got left. Her breath trembled. I don't know what to say. Then don't, he said gently. Just promise me you won't stop fightin'. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from grief, it was something closer to hope. Later that night, Caleb sat alone in his office, a lantern flickering beside him. Papers littered his desk, reports of missing cattle, unpaid debts, suspicious accidents. All tied back to one man, Hank Doyle. He picked up an old letter from Thomas Harper, filed months ago. To Sheriff's Office, Clearwater. If anything happens to me or my ranch, it won't be no accident. Ish. Caleb's heart pounded. Thomas had known. He stood, grabbing his hat and gun belt. There was only one thing left to do. The mayor's office, midnight. The mayor, a plump, nervous man, blinked as Caleb slammed the letter onto his desk. "Where'd you get this?" the mayor stammered. "Thomas Harper wrote it before he died," Caleb said. He knew Doyle was after his land. The same man whose men torched his widow's barn last night. "Now, Sheriff," the mayor said nervously, "you've got no solid proof. Hank Doyle's a respected man in this town. You go after him without evidence and you'll lose your badge." Caleb's voice was low and dangerous. "Then I'll lose it doing the right thing." He left without waiting for an answer. Back at the Harper place, the same night. The wind howled outside. Evelyn sat by the fire, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Every creak of the old house made her flinch. Then, faintly through the storm, she heard something, boots crunching on gravel. She rose, heart pounding. "Sheriff?" she whispered hopefully. But there was no answer. Just silence. Then, a soft tap on the window. Her breath caught. Outside, a shadow moved near the porch, and a whisper slid through the cold air. "Sell, or next time we don't leave a warning." Evelyn backed away, trembling, clutching the fire poker in both hands. And somewhere out there in the dark, a promise was about to be tested, because Caleb Turner would stop at nothing to protect her, even if it meant crossing every line the law had drawn. The next few days were tense and heavy, the kind of quiet that meant trouble was coming. Caleb had doubled his patrols, riding long hours through the valley. Every night, he stopped by the Harper place to make sure Evelyn was safe. Every night, she told him she was fine, though both knew that wasn't true. Evelyn slept little. Every sound outside made her heart race. She kept a lantern burning till dawn and a Bible by her bed, whispering verses under her breath to chase away fear. She'd started to realize something in those long, restless hours. She wasn't just afraid of losing the ranch anymore. She was afraid of losing him. One afternoon, by the river. The sun shone brighter that day, melting away the last of the frost. Evelyn went down to the river with a small basket of laundry, hoping to find a sliver of peace in the rhythm of washing clothes by hand. The water sparkled, catching the light like scattered diamonds. She remembered the first time the sheriff had found her here, how broken she'd been, how gentle his voice had sounded. Now, when she thought of him, something warm filled the hollow space where grief used to live. She smiled faintly, humming a tune as she worked, unaware that a pair of eyes watched her from the trees beyond the ridge. 2 men on horseback. Hank Doyle's men. "Boss says she ain't movin' fast enough," one muttered, spitting into the grass. The other sneered. Then maybe it's time she learned what happens to folks who ignore warnings. Moments later. Evelyn had just wrung out the last piece of linen when the sound of hooves thundered behind her. She turned, startled, as the 2 riders burst from the treeline. "Afternoon, Mrs. Harper," one called, his grin twisted. "We came to talk about your land." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "Please, just leave me be." The men dismounted, stepping closer. "Can't do that, ma'am. See, the boss don't take kindly to refusals. Now you can sign that deed over nice and easy or—" "I won't sign anything," she snapped, her voice trembling but fierce. The man's grin vanished. He grabbed her arm roughly. "You got a temper for a widow. Let go." Evelyn shouted, struggling. Her basket spilled, white cloths tumbling into the dirt. "Let go of her." The voice cracked through the air like thunder. Both men turned just in time to see Sheriff Caleb Turner riding in fast, his horse kicking up dust. The sunlight flashed off the steel of his revolver. He fired a warning shot. Dirt exploded near their boots. The men cursed and ducked. "Sheriff, this ain't your business," one yelled. Caleb's eyes burned with fury. "It is when a woman's being threatened in my county." They drew their guns. Caleb fired first. The shot rang out sharp and sure, clipping one man's hat clean off and grazing his shoulder. The second man fired back, the bullet whistling past Caleb's arm, close enough to tear his sleeve. Caleb swung off his horse, using it as cover, reloading fast. Evelyn dropped to the ground, shielding her head. The firefight echoed across the riverbank, gunpowder, smoke and shouts. When it ended, one man fled, bleeding and cursing, while the other lay groaning in the dirt, his pistol kicked away by Caleb's boot. Caleb turned to Evelyn. "You hurt?" She shook her head, breathless. "No, but you?" He glanced at his arm. A thin line of blood trickled down, staining his shirt. "Just a scratch." She ran to him, eyes wide. "You could have been killed." He smiled faintly, holstering his gun. "Worth it if it means you're safe." That evening, the cabin. Evelyn sat by the fire, wrapping a bandage around Caleb's arm. Her fingers trembled as she worked. His skin was warm beneath her touch and she could feel his steady pulse. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. They could have killed you. Caleb looked at her, his voice low. You think I'd let them hurt you? Her eyes lifted to meet his, so close now she could see the flecks of silver in his gray irises. I don't deserve your kindness, she said. I've been nothing but trouble since you found me. He shook his head slowly. You've been the reason I remember why I took this badge in the first place. Silence fell between them, thick and charged. The fire popped softly. Evelyn's heart pounded. She wanted to thank him, to tell him how he'd pulled her back from the edge of despair, but words failed. So she did the only thing her heart told her to do. She reached up and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. His breath caught, and in that stillness he reached out, cupping her face gently. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. Then Caleb stepped back, breaking the spell. I shouldn't, he murmured. You've been through too much. You need time. Evelyn's voice trembled. And what if time's already chosen for us? Caleb looked away, torn between duty and desire. If I let myself fall for you, I'll stop thinking straight. And right now, you need me clear-headed. She smiled sadly. Maybe you already fell, Sheriff? He gave a quiet, shaky laugh, the kind that sounded like both surrender and fear. When he finally met her eyes again, there was no denying it. Whatever had begun by that river weeks ago was no longer something either of them could control. Outside, the night was silent, but inside the Harper cabin, two hearts beat in rhythm, fragile but strong, like hope rekindled in the ashes of loss. Morning sunlight filtered through the cabin window, soft and golden. The scent of coffee filled the air, mingling with the crisp smell of pine drifting from outside. Caleb sat at the table, freshly bandaged and silent. Across from him, Evelyn poured him a cup, her hands still trembling from the night before. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, she broke the silence. You could have been killed yesterday. Caleb took the cup, eyes lowered. Wouldn't be the first time I've been shot at. That's not what I mean. She leaned forward, her voice thick with emotion. You risked everything for me, Caleb. Why? He looked up slowly. Because no one else would have. Because you didn't deserve to lose one more thing in this world. Her eyes glistened. And what if it cost you your job? He gave a half smile. A badge don't mean much if I can't use it to protect what's right. The visit from the mayor. Later that day, Caleb rode back into town. The streets were unusually quiet, folks pretending not to stare as he dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Word had spread fast, about the shootout by the river, about Hank Doyle's men limping into town. Inside, Mayor Tillman waited for him, arms folded tight. Sheriff Turner, he said coldly. You've stirred up a hornet's nest. Caleb took off his hat. Just doing my job. Your job? The mayor barked. Your job isn't to start gunfights with Doyle's ranch hands. You know how much he contributes to this town? The bank, the freight line, the cattle drives. We can't afford to lose him. Caleb's eyes hardened. So you'd rather lose your conscience? The mayor's face reddened. You're stepping on the wrong boots, Sheriff. Drop the case. Stop meddling in Doyle's affairs or you'll be out of a job. Caleb leaned forward, voice steady as a drawn gun. If doing my job means turning my back on a woman being threatened on her own land, then maybe I should lose it. For a long moment, the mayor just stared at him. Then he spoke quietly, dangerously. You keep this up, Turner, and you'll regret it. Caleb turned, his spurs clinking against the wooden floor. Not half as much as I'd regret doing nothing. The gathering storm. That night, Caleb rode out to the ridge overlooking the valley. From there, he could see the Harper Ranch, a small light glowing in the cabin window, Evelyn moving inside. He'd sworn an oath to uphold the law, but lately the law had started to look like a man's shadow, bending toward whoever held the most gold. And then there was her. Every time he saw her, strong yet fragile, haunted yet full of grace, he felt something inside him shift. She wasn't just a widow trying to survive. She was a reason worth fighting for. He clenched his jaw. If Hank Doyle wanted a war, he'd have one. Evidence in the dust. 2 nights later, Caleb and Deputy Jim went snooping around Doyle's freight barn. They moved in darkness, lanterns dimmed. Sure this is a good idea? Jim whispered. Best idea I've had all week, Caleb muttered. Inside they found ledgers, lists of names, shipment records, and payments. But among them were papers showing illegal land seizures, deeds signed under false pretenses, forged signatures, and even bribes to the mayor. Caleb's pulse quickened. This is it, he said. This is the proof. Before they could leave, a noise echoed behind them, boots crunching on gravel. They turned to find Hank Doyle himself standing in the doorway, lantern raised high. Well, Hank drawled. Didn't expect to find the law sneaking around my property like a thief. Caleb straightened. Funny thing about thieves, they usually steal from the innocent. You, on the other hand, steal everything else. Doyle's grin vanished. You don't know what you're stirring, Sheriff. Walk away while you still can. Caleb stepped closer. Not a chance. Hank's eyes darkened. Then I'll make sure that little widow of yours don't have nothing left but ashes. The threat cut deep. Caleb's hand went to his revolver, but before he could draw, Doyle's men surrounded the barn. Jim whispered, "We're outnumbered." "Not outmatched," Caleb growled. The fight for justice. Gunfire erupted. Lanterns shattered. Flames caught on the dry hay, turning the barn into a furnace of light and smoke. Caleb fought hard, ducking behind crates, firing precise shots. Jim managed to grab the ledger before a beam collapsed, splitting the roof. "Go," Caleb shouted. "Get it to the judge." "What about you?" "I'll hold him off." As Jim bolted out the back, Caleb turned to face Doyle, the two men locking eyes through the haze. "You're done, Hank?" Caleb yelled. Doyle laughed. "You think you can stop me with that badge?" Caleb glared. "No. With the truth." They clashed, fists and fury, the sheriff's blows fueled by months of frustration and buried anger. Finally, with a hard punch, Doyle went down, gasping. Caleb staggered out into the cool night air, smoke curling around him. His badge was blackened, his shirt torn, but his grip on justice, and his promise to Evelyn, burned brighter than ever. Back at the cabin. Evelyn was waiting by the door when he rode up, covered in soot and blood. She ran to him, heart racing. "Caleb." He caught her by the arms, exhausted but smiling faintly. "It's done. I got what we need." Her hands trembled as she touched his cheek. "You could have died." He leaned his forehead against hers. "I promised I'd keep you safe. That's a promise I aim to keep, no matter the cost." Tears filled her eyes. "What will happen now?" He looked out toward the rising dawn. "Tomorrow I turn in the evidence. But tonight," his voice softened, "tonight I just need to know you're here." Evelyn nodded, her hand finding his. "I'm here, Sheriff. And I'm not afraid anymore." The firelight flickered behind them, casting warm shadows across the cabin walls, a symbol of two wounded souls standing together against the dark. Morning broke quiet and clear over the town of Clearwater. The air smelled of rain and justice. Sheriff Caleb Turner walked up the courthouse steps with dust on his boots and fire in his eyes. His badge was tarnished, his arms still bandaged, but he carried the ledger, the proof of every lie Hank Doyle had ever told. Beside him stood Evelyn, her chin lifted high. For the first time since her husband's death, there was no fear in her eyes. Only strength and faith in the man walking beside her. The courtroom showdown. Inside, the mayor and half the town had gathered. Hank Doyle sat at the front, his jaw bruised, flanked by two of his men. The judge glanced between them all. "Sheriff Turner, you brought charges against one of Clearwater's largest landholders. I trust you have proof." Caleb nodded and laid the ledger on the table. "Every bribe. Every forged deed. Every stolen acre." The judge turned the pages slowly, the courtroom silent but for the soft rustle of paper. Then he looked up. "Mayor Tillman, your signature's here too." The mayor blanched, sweat beading on his forehead. I was deceived." Caleb's voice stayed calm. "You were bought." A murmur rippled through the room. The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough." He fixed his gaze on Doyle. "Hank Doyle, you stand accused of land fraud, extortion and attempted murder of a county officer. Do you deny it?" Doyle sneered, but his lawyer's eyes dropped to the floor. There was nothing left to deny. The judge's voice rang out. "This court finds Hank Doyle guilty on all counts. He is hereby sentenced to 20 years at hard labor." The room erupted, whispers, gasps, a few cheers. The mayor slunk away, pale as parchment. Caleb simply stood still, exhaling slowly. Justice at last. A sheriff without a badge. After the trial, Caleb walked out into the sunlight. He unpinned his badge from his chest, the metal catching the light one last time. Deputy Jim frowned. "You sure about this, boss?" Caleb smiled faintly. "The job's done. Time this town got a sheriff who don't have a target on his back." Jim nodded solemnly. "You'll always be the sheriff to us." Caleb handed him the badge. "Take care of him, Jim." Then he turned and saw Evelyn waiting by the hitching post, her skirt swaying in the wind, eyes soft and bright with pride. Back by the river. Later that afternoon, they rode out beyond the town, to the same quiet bend of the river where he had first found her crying weeks ago. The willows swayed gently, sunlight dancing on the surface of the water. Everything felt different now, lighter, freer. Evelyn stood by the bank, gazing at the rippling current. "I remember that day," she whispered. "I thought my life was over." Caleb stepped closer. "And I remember thinking, no one should cry alone by a river." She smiled, the faintest blush touching her cheeks. "You gave me back more than safety, Caleb. You gave me reason to breathe again." He looked at her, really looked, the way a man sees the dawn after years of storm. "You gave me something too. A reason to stay." For a long moment neither spoke. The world was all birdsong and the soft rush of water. Then Caleb took her hands gently in his. "Evelyn," he said, voice low and earnest, "I ain't a perfect man. I've seen too much, done things I ain't proud of. But if you'll have me, I'd spend the rest of my days making sure you never have to face this world alone again." Her breath caught, tears brightening her eyes, not from sorrow this time, but from the overwhelming beauty of grace restored. "I don't need a perfect man, Caleb Turner," she whispered. "Just one who won't walk away." He smiled, slow, soft, sure. "Then you've got him." He leaned down and their lips met, gentle at first, then deep with promise. The river murmured beside them like a witness to their vows. Epilogue: Hope comes home. Weeks later, the Harper Ranch was thriving again. Caleb helped rebuild the barn, his laughter echoing across the valley. Evelyn baked bread for the townsfolk, her smile once again a familiar sight in the market. Some evenings, children from town would see them walking by the river, the place where sorrow had turned to love. And though Caleb no longer wore the badge, justice lived in his eyes and kindness in his hands. Because sometimes the bravest thing a man can do isn't drawing his gun. It's opening his heart. A grieving lady found her peace by the river, and the sheriff who found her there discovered the home he never knew he needed.